People make promises every day, but what turns those promises into more than just words? Contracts are the legal magic that transforms mere words into binding obligations. Today, we're breaking down how words become law. Welcome to Organized, the business law breakdown. I'm Seth C. Oranburg, and I'm thrilled to have you here for the very first episode of this podcast. Whether you're a law student preparing for an exam, a lawyer sharpening your skills, or a business professional navigating deals and negotiations, this series is for you. In this season, we're going to dive deep into contract law, breaking down its complexities to show how agreements shape so much of what we do in both personal and business life. Contracts aren't just for legal experts. They're for anyone who engages in transactions, partnerships, or even simple promises. And understanding how contracts work gives you the tools to navigate these agreements with confidence. We'll explore key principles like what makes a contract enforceable, how breaches are handled, and what the remedies available when things go wrong are. But before we get to that, we're going to start with basics. Why contracts matter and how they're becoming such a fundamental part of our legal and business systems. So, whether you're new to contract law or looking to refine your understanding, this podcast will be your guide. Let's get started. This season is titled Mastering Contracts, and over the next several episodes, we're going to break down the essential building blocks of contract law. At its core, a contract is about turning promises into legally enforceable obligations. But what does that really mean? And how do courts determine whether an agreement is enforceable? That's where we're headed. We'll start by exploring the three foundational elements that every valid contract must have: offer, acceptance, and consideration. Each of these elements plays a crucial role. Let's take a quick preview. First, an offer is where a party proposes a set of terms to another. The offer must be clear and definite, leaving no ambiguity about its terms. Courts take offers seriously because this is where the contract starts to take shape. We'll discuss what makes an offer valid, how long an offer stays open, and what happens when an offer is revoked. Next comes acceptance. This is where the offeree, the person receiving the offer, agrees to the proposed terms. But like an offer, acceptance has to meet certain criteria to be legally binding. We'll break down how acceptance is communicated, whether silence can ever count as an acceptance, and what happens when the offeree proposes to change the offer. Finally, consideration, the value exchanged between the parties. Consideration is one of the most interesting and often misunderstood elements of a contract. It's not enough to just agree on terms. Something of value must be given by each party. Without consideration, agreement is simply a promise without legal weight. We'll look at how consideration works in everyday transactions and the role it plays in keeping contracts enforceable. Once we've covered these basics, we'll explore more complex aspects of contract law, like breach of contract. A breach occurs where one party fails to fulfill their end of the bargain, and can have serious legal consequences. In business, breaches of contract can result in lawsuits, financial damages, or specific performance, which is where a court orders the party to follow through on their obligations promised. We'll dive into the remedies available when a breach occurs, from monetary compensation to non-monetary remedies like rescission or reformation of the contract. But contracts don't always stay static. In business, deals change over time. That's why we'll also spend time discussing modifications to contract, how parties can renegotiate terms, change the scope of their agreement, or adjust deadlines. Modification can be as simple as adding an amendment to a written contract, or as complex as rewriting entire sections of a business deal. Throughout this season, we'll look at real-world examples and case studies. We'll talk about famous contract cases like Lucy v. Zemmer, where a casual conversation over drinks led to a legally binding agreement to sell a farm. We'll talk about famous contract cases like Lucy v. Zemmer, where what seemed to one party like a casual conversation led to a legally binding agreement to sell a family farm, even though one party claimed they were just joking. The case highlights one of the key principles in contract law, the objective theory of contracts. Courts don't necessarily care what you were thinking when you made an offer. They care about what a reasonable person would believe based on your words and actions. We'll also break down hypothetical scenarios that you might face in business or life. For example, what happens if you sign a contract and later realize that one of the terms was based on a mistake? Or what if you need to enforce a contract with someone who is now claiming they didn't have the legal capacity to enter into the agreement, or that they simply didn't understand what they were signing? These are just some of the topics we'll explore, and by the end of the season, you'll have a deeper understanding of how contracts work, how they're enforced, and why they matter in business and beyond. So, whether you're a law student preparing for your contract law exam or the bar exam, a lawyer brushing up on your contract skills, or a business professional who wants to negotiate smarter, this season of Organized, the Business Law Breakdown, will provide the insights you need. Contracts are everywhere, and by mastering these principles, you'll be better equipped to navigate the legal and business landscape with confidence. This season overview provides an in-depth look at the topics you'll cover in the season and adds context through real-world examples, famous cases, and practical applications. Imagine this. You're a business owner looking to purchase new office space. After years of searching, you finally find a property that suits your needs. You meet with the seller, agree on a price, shake hands, and think you've struck a deal. The seller promises that they'll finalize the paperwork within a week. You leave that meeting feeling confident you've secured the property. But legally speaking, do you have a binding contract? Well, not quite. While you and the seller may have agreed on the price terms verbally, there's still a lot from this agreement to make it enforceable in a court of law. Why is that? Let's break down the key elements you need for it to be legally binding. The first element we need is a clear offer. In this case, the seller has offered to sell you the property for an agreed price. But for that offer to hold up in court, it needs to be specific. The terms must be clear. What exactly are you buying? When will the transfer take place? Are there any conditions to the sale? Courts don't like vagueness contracts. Sufficient ambiguity could render the contract invalid. Next, we need acceptance. You, as the buyer, have accepted the offer verbally. But verbal acceptance isn't always enough, especially for something as significant as purchasing real estate. In fact, most jurisdictions require real estate contracts to be in writing. So, while you've shaken hands and verbally agreed, without written acceptance, this deal may not be enforceable. And finally, we need consideration. This is the value that each party brings to the table. You're offering to pay the agreed price, and the seller is offering to transfer the property. Giving consideration is a critical part of any contract because it shows both parties are giving and getting something they value. Without consideration, there is no binding contract, just a promise with no legal teeth. In our handshake deal, the intent is clear, but without these elements, clear offer, unambiguous acceptance, and consideration in writing, you don't yet have an enforceable contract. The seller could walk away, and you may have no legal recourse. This is why written agreements are so critical in business transactions, particularly for high-value deals like real estate. This brings us to one of the most famous cases in contract law, Lucy v. Zemmer. In this case, a man named Mr. Zemmer and his wife agreed over drinks to sell their farm to Mr. Lucy. They wrote out the agreement on the back of a restaurant receipt and even signed it. But when Mr. Lucy tried to enforce the contract, Mr. Zemmer claimed it had all been a joke. He argued that they were drinking and he never seriously intended to sell his farm. The court, however, didn't buy the defense. They ruled in favor of Mr. Lucy, stating that the outward appearance of the agreement, including the signed receipt, was enough to show a serious intent to be bound by the terms of the agreement. This is an important lesson in contract law. Courts don't necessarily care what you were thinking privately. What matters is how your actions and words would be interpreted by a reasonable person. So when you're making deals, whether it's for business or something personal, keep in mind that the contract's enforceability depends on having clear terms, a definitive acceptance, and consideration that can be demonstrated in court. Verbal agreements and handshakes might work in everyday life, but it comes to serious transactions, you'll want those in writing. What if the deal were for something smaller, more casual, and between acquaintances? Imagine you've agreed to buy a laptop from a friend for $400. You both shake hands. The next day, your friend changes their mind. Is the handshake enough to hold them to the deal legally? The answer is, it depends. The price of the laptop is low enough that it likely doesn't fall under the statute of frauds, which requires certain contracts to be in writing. What exactly were the terms of the agreement? Was there a clear offer and unambiguous acceptance? And finally, was there consideration exchanged? Did both of you provide something of value, such as money or goods, to seal the deal? This what if highlights the importance not only of having clear offer and acceptance, but also documenting agreements that have significant value to avoid future disputes. Now let's change the what if and look at something much more modest, like a handshake agreement that we discussed earlier. Imagine you're agreeing to buy a used laptop from a friend for $400. You both shake hands. The next day, your friend changes their mind. Is the handshake enough to hold them to the deal legally? The answer may be, it depends. The price of the laptop is low enough that it likely doesn't fall under the statute of frauds, which requires certain contracts to be in writing. However, there may still be issues around clarity. What exactly were the terms of the agreement? Was there a clear offer and an unambiguous acceptance? Was there consideration exchanged? Did both parties provide each other something of value to seal the deal? This what if highlights the importance of not only having a clear offer and acceptance, but also documenting agreements that involve valuable items or long-term commitments. It's always safer to put these things in writing to avoid these kinds of disputes. Contracts aren't just for courtrooms and business meetings. They even show up in pop culture. Think about the movie The Social Network, the movie about Facebook's origins. There's a famous moment where the characters sketch out the terms of an agreement on a napkin, thinking it's a simple way to seal the deal. But as the movie shows, informal agreements like this often lead to major disputes. Years later, the parties involved in that early agreement were embroiled in lawsuits over who owned what and how much they were owed. It's a reminder that even casual contracts, like one scribbled on a napkin, can have serious legal consequences, especially when the stakes are high. That's why understanding what a contract legally is enforceable is so important. Pop culture gives us plenty of dramatic examples, but the reality is contracts need to meet certain standards if you want to avoid costly disputes. Throughout this episode, we'll be exploring contracts in depth with some key features to keep things practical and engaging. Each episode will feature break it down segments where we'll take real world scenarios and break them down step by step to show how contract law applies in everyday life and business. We'll also throw in some what if scenarios where we'll explore how slight changes in facts can lead to different outcomes. It's a great way to see how nuanced contract law can be and why paying attention to detail really matters in the law. And of course, we'll try to keep it fun by bringing in pop culture examples from movies and TV shows to real world disputes involving celebrities. You'll see how contracts play out both in reality and in entertainment. Episodes should run about 15 to 20 minutes, giving us time to dive into the concepts, apply them to real world cases, and walk away with actionable takeaway items. If today's breakdown of contract law got you thinking, or if you're curious about how law applies these principles in your life, be sure to subscribe to Organized, the Business Law Breakdown. Whether you're studying for the bar exam, negotiating business deals, or just trying to get a better grasp of the legal side of agreements and business, this podcast and this season will give you better insights that you need to understand contract law and business law at a deeper level. This podcast is all about making business law accessible and practical. So if you know anyone who could benefit from these discussions, whether they're a law student, a business professional, or even someone who just wants to better understand how the legal system works, feel free to share this episode with them. In our next episode, we'll start with the very foundation of contracts. What makes a promise a contract? We'll dive into the three essential elements of any enforceable contract: offer, acceptance, and consideration. And if you ever wondered what transforms a simple agreement and mere words into a legally binding contract that courts will enforce, you won't want to miss it. We'll cover real-world examples, break down famous cases, and show how these principles apply in business transactions, personal agreements, and more. By the end of this episode, you'll have a clearer understanding of what makes contracts work and why promises are so vital to business and to life. So stay tuned and remember to subscribe. In our next episode, we'll start with the very foundation of contracts. What makes a contract? We'll dive into the essential elements of enforceable contracts. If you've ever wondered what transforms simple words into a legally binding contract, or how courts determine whether a contract even exists, you won't want to miss it. We'll cover real-world examples, break down famous cases, and show how these principles apply in business transactions, personal agreements, and more. By the end of that episode, you'll have a much clearer understanding of what makes contracts work and why they're so vital to business and life. So stay tuned and remember to subscribe. This season is all about giving you the tools to understand the power of contracts and how they shape the world around us. That's it for today's episode. We have just scratched the surface of contract law, and I'm excited to take this journey with you as we dive deeper into what makes contracts work in the real world. Whether you're a law student preparing for exams, a business professional navigating deals, or simply someone interested in understanding how agreements shape the world around us, this season will help you master the key concepts that govern contracts. Until next time, keep your agreements strong and your arguments stronger.